A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Shabbos at the Gitter.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geberer.
Yehuda Geberer with Jewish History Soundbites, and this double or triple episode on Mike Tress, the life and times of this legendary activist, is dedicated by his family. L'zecher nishmas Harav Elimelech Gavriel ben Reb Gershon Zatzal ve'ishtoi ha'isha chashuva maras Hinda bas Rachel Zal. Reb Elimelech, also known as Mike Tress, and his wife Hinda. And on that note, I want to thank the various family members for graciously sharing information. They gave of their time to share anecdotes, memories, insight. The sons of Mike Tress, who gave of their time, who shared their memories, their perspectives and stories. Another relative of the family, Yassel Heisman, who's in general a Jewish history legend. And a special thank you to David Rydell, who's a grandchild of Mike Tress, who runs the family archives, and he shared so much correspondence and documents, and he's the resident historian and archivist of the family of Mike Tress, and he has done invaluable research in this regard. So I want to thank him for just giving, again, so much of his time and sharing so much of that. What I'm going to be speaking about today comes from him and Mike Tress's sons and the family for making this episode happen, the special episode happen. Also, a special note to the amazing work of the Kleinman Holocaust Education Center for all the work they're doing for Holocaust education and research, important and valuable work. This is a two-part, maybe three-part. We'll see. Officially we'll try to get it in two. If we don't have to run out of time, I'll just do a third part. There's a lot to say. But it's a mini-series on Mike Tress, and it is episode numbers 299 and 300 of Jewish History Soundbites. So it's a very special occasion. Part 1 right now is 299. Part 2, which is going to be later this week, is number 300, which is quite a milestone, if I might say so myself. So I'm going to take the opportunity to take stock of what has been accomplished. Starting off, this podcast was almost an afterthought to try to, generate interest in trips and in Jewish history, and it literally has taken on a life of its own and become a movement which is generated by the listeners and the active participants involved in Jewish History Soundbites. And when you study history enough, you learn to never take anything for granted. So Jewish History Soundbites as a phenomenon should not be taken for granted either. The consistency that we keep on having more episodes and new material, new perspectives, new sources, that it's always growing in numbers of listeners and all that. That's really, quite an accomplishment and not to be taken for granted. And that's really all thanks to you all for making it happen. And of course, a thank you to the dedicated and professional production staff for their constant work, friendship, and professionalism. But like I said, a special thank you to the listeners for listening. You're the ones who make Jewish History Soundbites into the community that it is, and it keeps me going as well to keep on producing. And I especially appreciate all the feedback. It's always great to hear from listeners. I met some great people along the way, some very nice people, very nice feedback. It's always heartwarming and keeps me going. and also the critique, the corrections. It keeps me on my toes. We have an educated, well-read, and knowledgeable group of listeners out there, and you have made sure that Jewish History Soundbites keeps the standards of accuracy and objectivity that we stand for here. So thank you for that. And it exposes me to new sources. You've pointed me in the right direction. You've even taught me English. So thank you all. Last but not least, our sponsors. And at this point, it would not be possible to continue the project of Jewish History Soundbites without episode sponsors. And many of you have stepped up to sponsor episodes, even series, like here, the Tress, members of the Tress family have taken up to sponsor this mini-series. So then many of you have done things like that. Partial sponsorships also have been received, and that's amazing and very much appreciated. It keeps Jewish History Soundbites going strong and has generated some interesting topics and content as well. Those who have advertised their businesses or projects on Jewish History Soundbites have seen productive and tangible results. We have a great target audience here, and all of you business owners out there, take heed to where you may want to invest and sponsor an episode in the future. And any other potential sponsors out there, we'd love to have everyone on board to ensure that Jewish History Soundbites continues to grow and flourish, providing the best Jewish history content out there. So you can be in touch with me about sponsorships. The story now of Mike Tress will be a 2-part mini-series, perhaps 3 if need be. And we have lots of material, so we might need 3 to get to it all. But I propose that it can perhaps also be a launch for an extended series on great Jewish leaders, askanim, activists, etc. There are many out there, and their stories can be told with their respective contributions on the stage of Jewish history. So I welcome listeners who would like to have subsequent episodes profiling other leaders to be in touch with me about sponsoring those episodes. You can arrange that with me or any other sponsorship opportunity. So we approach the story of the life and times of Mike Tress in the context of where this incredible leader emerged and the accomplishments that he did and the impact that he had on American Orthodoxy. He's literally one of the great architects of American Orthodoxy. There's a great biography out there by Jonathan Rosenblum, a fantastic biography. They called him Mike, very long, thorough, did a well treatment of it, nearly 3 decades following his passing. So it was a very impressive work. Much more, but it's also written almost 30 years ago. So it's much more has come to light since then. I think that the biography needs a remake, like the good movies, Gone with the Wind, Ben-Hur. No one's watching the original ones, even though Ben-Hur was the first movie to be shot in the state of Israel, and the remake was shot in Ouarzazate in Morocco. And I saw the set actually when I was in Morocco recently. So everyone wants to watch the remake, and it introduces it to another generation. So I think this biography is in need of a remake as well. That would be very, very effective. Subsequently, following the publication of the biography, there's been all kinds of articles and video documentaries have sprung up, some focusing on his rescue work, others on his building of Agudath Yisroel of America, still others on his personal biography, his life. There's an audio of a speech of his that has parts of it have become available. There was a great Yated Ne'eman article several years ago with rich memories from all his sons. I will liberally cite from those interviews as well. There are other articles too. He was someone who accomplished so much, and there's so much to say, who had a tremendous impact on American Jewish life. The esteem that he was held by his peers and by the great Torah leaders of the day. And keep in mind, this was a clean-shaven fellow. He was not a rabbi. He was English-speaking, American-born, a businessman, and possibly the greatest builder of Yiddishkeit that the United States Orthodox community has ever known, and unique in the annals of public advocacy, activism, and leadership in several ways, which I will elaborate on. And there are 3 components of his story. There's his biography itself, there's his building of Agudas Yisroel, Zeirei Agudas Yisroel, and then there's his rescue work during the years leading up to the war, and then during the Holocaust, and then in the aftermath, post-liberation. So those are really 3 stories, there are 3 components. And I'd like to approach it in that order. I'd like to first focus on his biography, then on Agudas Yisroel, and then his rescue work. I'm assuming that the rescue work is we're only going to get to in part 2. So let's see how far we get and how much we accomplish now in part 1, and we'll pick it up from wherever we leave off. Wherever we get to will be released later this week, so you don't have to wait that long, just another day or two. We'll release the second part, and we'll continue with the story from wherever we leave off. So he's someone who did not live very long. He was born in 1909, and he passes away, unfortunately, at quite a young age, 56, 57, in the year 1967. He's orphaned from his father, Gershon Tress, when he was a baby, 1 or 2 years old, and he's raised by his mother, Henya, and his aunt, who was later the Agudas Yisroel, the president of Agudas Yisroel, Ramesha Sherer's mother. His parents, Mike Tress's parents, were immigrants from Ukraine, and he himself was born in New York City. His mother served as the president of the ladies' auxiliary of the Stoliner based medrash in Williamsburg. It was a very religious family. They came from Stoliner Hasidim, and they were closely affiliated with the religious life, with Stoliner life that was emerging in New York at the time. But Mike Tress, he was known as Mike. His name was Elimelech Gavriel, but he was always known as Mike. In fact, towards the end of his ready in Agudas Yisroel was a force to be reckoned with, and it was a big organization and much more formal than in the Haimish early days. So he was introduced at an Agudah dinner with all the appropriate introduction that a president of a major Jewish organization would be introduced. And when he gets to the microphone, he says, "I appreciate all the introductions, but you can just call me Mike." And he, as a throwback to those early days when it was much more Haimish. I'm trying to think of the best translation. I don't think there is a good translation for Haimish. And he was always Mike. He was Mike Tress. So he subsequently would enjoy a very close personal relationship with all the great Torah leaders across the religious and political spectrum, irrespective of background or religious or political affiliation. So the fact that he came from a specific Hasidic dynasty and religious background did not have an effect on who he would associate with later on. He literally associated with everyone. He himself attended public school. He never attended a yeshiva. There weren't really that many yeshivas around in Williamsburg in those days. Then he was college educated. He went to school, got a degree, and then he entered the business world. He was very successful in business. He was a brilliant individual and very driven, very motivated, a very hard worker. So he became very successful. He was very wealthy. By all accounts, he had a tremendous amount of charisma, a magnetic personality. People were very drawn to him and were in awe of him, people who speak about him. He seems like one of those rare personalities as a human being, as a person, a very rare personality that just had a lot of, magnetic, very charismatic. In fact, there's who was, I think, Rav Shraga Mendelovich, who of course they were closely associated as well. So he once referred to him as there's people who are great Talmidei Chachamim, great Torah scholars, Torah leaders, and then there's someone who's a Gadol Hadar. Now today, when we use the term, we throw it around a lot, and there's always a big dispute who is and who isn't. The term Gadol Hadar, the greatest one of the generation, and we're almost always referring to a great Torah scholar, a leading tzaddik, a leading Torah scholar, and yet Rav Shraga Feivel said the Gadol Hadar just means the great one of the generation. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's referencing a big rabbi. And he said a Gadol Hadar just could mean someone who's incredibly great, an amazing leader who has such an impact on Yiddishkeit and on Jewish life and in leadership. And he said, so the Gadol Hadar in our generation, he was referring to his own, is Mike Tress, because he's the great one of the generation, despite the fact that he's not the big Rosh Hashiva or the big Hasidic Rebbe. He devoted his life to the ideal that he believed in, and in order to do so, he retired from his successful business, and then he liquidated all of his assets, which is a theme I'm going to return to in more detail as we go along. He was completely devoted to the cause, a turning point in his life was the visit of Rav Elchonon Wasserman, the Baranovich Rosh Yeshiva, who came to the United States to fundraise for his yeshiva in Baranovich, and he stayed for about close to a year and a half in 1938, 39, and then in 37. And Mike Tress was captivated by Rav Elchonon. It was a transformative experience. He maintained a correspondence with him subsequently. And Rav Elchonon is the one who urged him to abandon his business and devote his life to communal work. And the parting words when Rav Elchonon returned to Europe, to return to his yeshiva in 1939, so the parting words that he had to Mike Tress was, the future of Torah, or the future of Yiddishkeit in the United States, is in your hands. And he literally gave him this mission. And this Rav Elchonon has changed his life. He devoted himself to klal work. He sold his business off as a result, and this had a decisive impact. He carried a letter of Rav Elchonon with him, folded in his wallet for the rest of his life. He carried it with him, a letter that Rav Elchonon had written to him. Mike Tress brought in 1941, when Rav Aaron Cutler arrived as a refugee in the United States. So one of the few people who greeted Rav Aaron in Manhattan's Penn Station, Grand Central Station, Penn Station, who knows? And in April 1941, to greet Rav Aaron Cutler was Mike Tress with a group of Zeirei Agudas Yisroel followers. They were from the few who appreciated who Rav Aaron was and who decided to go out and greet him. There was also a delegation of the Agudath Rabbanim, of course, and Mike Tress. In other words, he has this theme and this understanding of what's central to the Orthodox identity that he's trying to build, and he wanted his young charges to see that right away. In his business, he'd hire Jewish girls so that they wouldn't have to work on Shabbos. Then when he still had a business, like I said, he sold his business. He used his own savings, a lot of savings, and he had a stock investment portfolio. He sold off all his stock. He sold off all his investments. He then went ahead and mortgaged his home 3 times, all for the greater good of the community. So his biography and his public work became one at some point in his life, because he no longer had anything of his own. He was completely devoted to the community. And the interesting thing to point out is that we're focusing on his biography aspect here, the challenge of his growing up himself. In other words, we talk so much about how he impacted the growth of Orthodoxy in America. What about his own upbringing? How did he himself stay Orthodox? He's an orphan, growing up in the United States in the 1910s and 20s. It's almost astounding that he himself remained Orthodox. He went to public school. He was raised by a single mother, and he goes to college and goes into business, and yet he stays religious. He doesn't work on Shabbos, right? So just the fact that he himself was able to overcome those challenges in his own life and remain devoted to Orthodox Judaism is enough a story itself. He gets married in about June 1939. He and his wife is marrying a successful businessman. And then they gave it all up with a growing family. Every year another child is born. He eventually has 11 children, 4 boys, 7 girls. And there's, no more financial security. He's constantly traveling, constantly away from home. So it's very much a tribute to her, Hinda Tress, his wife, Mrs. Hinda Tress, that she enabled him to do that. She was, it was absolutely amazing what she was able to do. She at one point had 5 children under the age of 5 at home. And when she was asked how did she do it, she said, "You just did what you had to do," because she recognized and believed in what her husband was doing. She looked up to him and was amazed and recognized the importance of it. So she went ahead and allowed him to do it. And not just allowed, she enabled him to be able to go and carry that out. And he didn't get any covet or thank yous from it, only grief and more grief, because it was a different world of public activism at the time. It wasn't a place where he got many thank yous. But he spent his life devoted to the Jewish people. And most public activists, Jews in any community, they kept a business keep a business on the side. They have their own life, they have their own income, or they draw an income, a salary from whatever organization they're running. He might be one of the only askanim, leaders, activists who completely gave everything away. So much so that towards the end of his life, when he had open heart surgery, the Kapishnitzar Rebbe, who he was very close with, had to pay the $3,000 for him to be able to get to Texas for this experimental open heart surgery as a loan. One of his one of Mike Tress's daughters saw in the newspaper once that a business that he had previously been a partner in was sold for $3 million in the 1960s. So the daughter said, wow, how different things could have been had you remained a partner in the business. So he responded, thank God that things turned out differently. Look how much we were able to accomplish. Rav Elchonon Wasserman had sent him a letter when he was a chassan, when he was a groom, ready to get married, with a typical blessing on the eve of a marriage. And then right after that, he speaks about the projects on Baranovich Yeshiva, and we need to raise money, and he runs right into it in that same letter. In other words, they recognized him as someone who's never sitting on his laurels. He's always running and moving and working towards the next project. And that's the letter, actually, that he kept folded in his wallet for the rest of his life. He was in awe of all Zeirei Yisroel, all great Torah leaders, even when he didn't know them, even when it was only people he had heard about. And he was even able to inspire others of the next generation to look up to them as well as if he had himself known them. The last 8 years of his life, he suffered from heart disease. He had a heart attack when he was 49, so he was semi-retired after that. He passes away quite young, like I said. So in the 1960s, he was already not really involved. He was less involved in Agudath Yisroel. He's already weaker. So that makes it even more incredible because the entire Mike Tress story is only 20 plus years. That's the whole thing. That's the whole story we're talking about. And even before that, again, in his personal life, he was engaged. His engagement was close to 2-year engagement. Why? Because his mother was sick, and he wanted to take care of his mother. So he asked his bride if they can push off the engagement until she gets better. Unfortunately, she did not get better. She died, but he only got married afterwards. He's married at the age of 28, 29. In his home, he was a devoted father. Every Friday, he would buy new dresses for his 7 daughters, new for Shabbos, something new every Shabbos. And at the Shabbos table, he would make sure to serve some of the courses in the meal, because his wife worked hard all week and he was very often away and not around. So he wanted to. He's serving. He's clearing the table, at least for some of the courses. He's there and at the Shabbos table. And this is later on in life. There was no money in the house, and they struggled financially. But yet still, as a devoted father and husband, he was he made it a warm and loving house to be in. So he would go every week, once a week. On every Sunday, he would go to Torah Vodas, where his sons studied, and he would speak to every Rebbe of all his children. There was a PTA every Sunday for his kids, unlike other parents who were probably not nearly as busy as he was, who came once or twice a year for the PTA. He was there once a week, and he would try to take his children on trips, on excursions. Took them out to Staten Island, going by the subway and then the ferry, and then a bus from the ferry to the park, where they would go and play for a whole day in the park, rowing on the lake. Again, just to be as much as he could, as much as his busy schedule allowed it, to be a father. He was the CEO of a big textile company, the Lampert Brothers, when he was still in business, and he was able to secure many jobs for Jewish girls who to be able to not work on Shabbos. He was also later on a partner in the Esquire shoe polish company, that was the one that was later sold for millions of dollars. But the reason he left that company was because his partner refused to close on Shabbos. So he that's something he willingly gave up. When one of his projects, which we'll talk about when we talk about Agudath Yisroel, was the Camp Agudah. And they bought their campus in the Catskills, and the bank wanted collateral. So he was negotiating the deal, and he had already given everything away. He was already broke at that point. The only thing that he had left was his own life insurance policy. And the bank accepted that as collateral. So later on, the Agudah defaulted and was not able to make the payment on the mortgage of their campus. So the bank cashed in on his life insurance policy. So when he passed away, it was empty, literally nothing. His wife, Hinda, had to go out and get a job right after the shiva was over, just to be able to make sure there was food on the table. Another memory that a child shared of the home was that he always had guests in the house, and it was all types of people. It didn't make a difference who they were. They were a Jew in need. They found a place at the table. Didn't matter what they looked like, what their background was. It made no difference. And he said someone who was not refined at all was eating there at their house very repulsively. He spit half of his food back onto the plate, and one of Mike Tress's children made a face, and he looks at him and he asks him to leave the room, and he says, "Do you know who this Jew is? Do you know what he went through? How can you make a face at him?" And that's again part of the education that he had to his children. So we move into the story of his building Agudath Yisroel of America. And he's not the one who founded Zeirei, the young, which is the organization that he's become associated with, the young members of Agudath Yisroel of America. That credit goes to another group of visionary young men. It was for young working guys who had not attended yeshiva. They got together in the evenings. It was very social. There was shiurim, there were classes. It was early daf yomi shiurim, actually. They had shalosh shudas get-togethers, malav malka. It was kind of like an Orthodox social fraternity. What Mike Tress did was join this nascent federation of social clubs and give it organization. He gave it passion. He gave it a vision, and most of all, a sense of mission. And this goaded it to accomplishments until it truly became a movement. Now, bear in mind that the Young Israel movement and other Orthodox movement organizations are in its early stages. And Young Israel, for instance, seem to be catering to the very same demographic, and we're accomplishing great strides in Orthodoxy in doing so. There was even some overlap with Zeirei Agudas Yisroel, as for example, the Young Israel of Nulatz out in Brooklyn story attests. Mayor Birnbaum, the famous Lieutenant Birnbaum, describes how his Young Israel of Nulatz was almost like a branch of Zeirei Agudas Yisroel at the same time. Yet Mike believed that Agudath Yisroel and Zeirei, Pirchei, Bnos had a unique mission. And in the only known audio recording of Mike Tress, it was a speech at a Pirchei dinner honoring Josh Silberman's, the head of Pirchei, Mr. Pirchei, in 1956-57, shortly following his return from Vienna after the Hungarian Revolution. He speaks with a passion about the meaning of Agudath Yisroel to him and its mission, galvanizing his audience to join him on this mission. And he speaks about his awe of the great Torah leaders of Agudath Yisroel, speaks about them with such pathos. And most of them are people who he had never even met, and yet he describes to describe them and with this shouting, this passion, this charisma, this, like dynamite. And he describes his attending the fourth Knessia of Agudath Yisroel in Yerushalayim in 1954, 2 years earlier, and his meeting the Ger Rebbe, the Beis Yisrael. He talks about the contemporary Torah leaders in the United States who are then currently at the helm of the Agudah in America, and he explains his mission. It was such a strong mission in his mind that he founds Camp Agudah, even though it was during the war. Even though he was completely devoted to rescue activity and fundraising for rescue activity, he founds Camp Agudah because he believed in the mission. Because he saw, and this is a fascinating piece of history, the way he saw Agudah, is that he kind of saw it as almost like, I guess if we would put it in contemporary terms, a kiruv organization. It was outreach to encourage orthodoxy. And this is unique to the fact that it was the United States, and unique to the fact that it was Zeirei Agudas Yisroel of America, not Agudath Yisroel of America. It was a very unique niche that he captured here. In Europe, Agudath Yisroel in Europe, in Germany, in Poland, especially in Poland, and then later in the state of Israel, Agudath Yisroel was a political machine. It was an Orthodox political machine. It was an Orthodox political party, and it was an Orthodox political party out to promote Yiddishkeit and build Yiddishkeit, Orthodox Judaism. But it was a political party. And the Agudath Yisroel of America was built very differently because of Mike Tress, because Zeirei becomes the dominant force of Agudath Yisroel of America. Agudath Yisroel of America, as an adult organization, only comes much later. They had planted the seeds earlier, already from the early 1920s, but it was only picked up by Rebekah Silver in the late 1930s, and then even more so when Mike Tress joins the Agudath Yisroel of America in the 1940s and 50s. But in the beginning, the dominant Agudah of America is Zeirei, and it's Mike Tress, and it's a kiruv organization. It's to promote orthodoxy. It's Shmiras Shabbos campaigns. It's Camp Agudah to get public school kids to experience Yiddishkeit and try to encourage them to attend yeshiva. It was the idea of, and only later it reaches the national stage. Zeirei Agudas Yisroel tries to support upstart yeshivas, girls' schools, the early Beis Yaakovs. Pirchei and Bnos becomes the main vehicles of his activity and gatherings and trips. They go on summer trips and weekends and social gatherings with Malkas. He ran the Pirchei and Zeirei meetings almost every night of the week, different chapters in different parts of New York and members in each place, and he continues to do so even during the war years when he was deeply involved in rescue work. He believed that the key to building Orthodoxy was from the youth up, and he never even bothered targeting middle-aged adults. He focused completely on the youth. Milava Malkas were the big thing at the time, and he would attend every Milava Malka. He would always speak, very often inspiring his young charges with the same message. At the same time, he would speak about very often the same theme, same message, and it never got stale. He spoke about it with such a passion each time. And like I said, even it was beyond Agudas Yisroel, like the story of the young Israel of Nulats, and the way that Meyer Birnbaum speaks about it, is that Mike Tress would come and inspire them as well, even though they were not officially a chapter of Agudas Yisroel. The headquarters of Zeirei Agudas Yisroel was at 616 Bedford Avenue in Williamsburg, and that became the center of his activity. That's where his office was. It's a place that houses refugees, and it's a place that he even has when he invites Mr. Joseph Rosenberger, who's the pioneer of shatnez in the United States, to open his first shatnez lab. And where's he going to do it? At 616 Bedford Avenue in Agudas Yisroel headquarters, and that's where the shatnez lab is housed for many years. So he's a very charismatic personality, very dynamic. People revere him, youth, donors, adults, Rosh Yeshiva, tzaddikim, simple people. And this lays the foundations for Yiddishkeit in America. That was his Agudah work. So fundamentally, it was fundamentally different than the European and later the Israeli Agudah. It was not a political organization. It was a Yiddishkeit organization to build Yiddishkeit. It was very important. It's very important to understand his role in that difference from the other Agudas, because it may have had the same name, but it was very different in nature as a result. And then, of course, there's post-war Agudah work. Chinuch Atzmai, Beis Yaakov, Zeirei, continuing Pirchei, Camp Agudah. He belonged to all of the Jewish people. He was respected across the spectrum, even way outside the borders of Agudas Yisroel, by Hasidic leaders, Rosh Yeshiva, Lithuanian leaders, Yekis, Zionists, on the right and the left, even outside of Agudah, because he was there for a cause, a goal. Food and sleep and materialism and all this meant nothing to him. He was singly focused on helping people, and he lived to help people, and it wasn't politically motivated. So he even said that the reason he had passed away at such a young age is because everyone's pain was his pain, and that gave him his heart condition. So that's what slowed him down, like I said, several years before his passing. So he, I think, and here we're pretty much wrapping up the Agudah stage of his life, so we'll head on with the rescue activity in part 2. It's the major story of his life, major theme of his career and activism. We'll focus more on his rescue work and wrap up some loose ends from his biography and Agudah work as well. And if we need, we have no problem going into a part 3 also. So this is Yehuda Geber, the Jewish History Soundbites, with part 1 of Mike Tress. Part 2 to come soon. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on Twitter at JSoundbites, and I hope you enjoyed.